welcome to LawPod. I am Lauren Dempster. I'm a senior lecturer here in the School of Law at Queen's University Belfast, and I am delighted to be joined today by Oran Finegan, who is the Director of Forensic Action International, to talk about his work. Oran, could you briefly introduce yourself for our listeners?
Firstly, thanks a million. It's a real pleasure to be here and have a chance to chat with you today on what is a very, still not emerging, but certainly essential topic and issue, certainly in the current climate and environment that we're dealing with. So who am I? I've been working in both the humanitarian and human rights sector as a forensic specialist for the past almost just over 25 years. Those 25 years have brought me to over 50 contexts around the globe, working with international agencies like the United Nations, and more recently and extensively with the International Committee of the Red Cross, looking to help build forensic capacity of states and agencies to address the needs of the deceased and those affected by their loss or their disappearance. Could talk for many hours, I think, on that and the various places and issues. But in a nutshell, I founded Forensic Action International following my time with these various agencies to try and bring further into the spotlight the importance of recognizing the need to deal with the dignity and respect of the deceased in conflict and disasters, and to importantly put those affected at the center and allow them to help design these programs to best ensure that their needs from a cultural and religious perspective are respected, and that ultimately the dead are not forgotten and that their name can be returned to them. So I think that in a nutshell, that's where I find myself, and I've moved back to my beloved Ireland, where I now live with my partner in Swords. And so reintegrating into Irish life, which I think I've done as best as I can, given almost just over 20 years away from the country.
Thank you, Oran. We're going to focus particularly today on your work in context of recovering the disappeared and the missing. But I guess to go back in time a little bit, could you tell us how you first got into this field of work?
So I certainly didn't speak with my guidance counsellor in secondary school and say, I want to work in humanitarian forensics. I had always a very passionate interest in science, but also in, I think, issues from a humanitarian and human rights perspective. I remember as a child avidly boycotting South African produce during the apartheid era. And I think throughout my early life, that was something that really I held as of great importance to me. My initial time, actually, I'm an alumni of Queen's University. I studied anatomy there for my primary degree, a fantastic university and one I will always have fond memories of. But I realized that there was something missing from the direction I wanted to go in. And following this, chatting with a mentor and relation of mine, Professor Moira O'Brien, the first female anatomist professor in Trinity College in Dublin, she advised me to look into the field of physical anthropology, and I ended up taking on a postgrad in forensic anthropology. And finishing that master's, my advisor said to me, look, they're looking to recruit forensic anthropologists to work with the International Crimes Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia over in Bosnia. This is back in 98. And I jumped at the opportunity. And that was really the start of my career and my work in this domain.
So coming on to that area then of your work in terms of your experience in the former Yugoslavia, could you reflect a bit on your experience? I know it's, as you said, it's 25 years, but could you reflect a bit on your experience of working as a forensic expert, specifically in contexts that are emerging from conflict or post-conflict?
My first experience in Bosnia in 98 is one that I think I've come back to more in recent times to try and understand how it affected me and how it influenced where I went in my career. But I think a number of things. I think seeing it firsthand the worst of humanity, dealing with the consequences of, for example, the war graves of Srebrenica, but at the same time being surrounded by a team of international scientists driven and passionate about looking to collect evidence to bring to account those who had committed those atrocities. I found two very powerful factors, and two that certainly came to drive me forward in my work. So while all of this work, I think, certainly finds itself in some of the more disturbing and instances of conflict, I think there is something good that emerges from that, which shows the true humanitarian passion of individuals to help return an identity to someone who has died and to aid in bringing those responsible to account.
There's a couple of elements from what you said there that I'd like to pick up on. So one is the international nature of this type of work. And as some of our listeners will know, Argentina is probably the place where we saw the first major developments in terms of using forensic expertise to recover the remains of the disappeared. In that context, it was those disappeared under the Argentinian dictatorship. And also you talked about scientists coming together. So could you say a bit about the role of international experts, but also collaboration in the work and in terms of moving forward efforts to recover the disappeared and the missing?
I think the example you refer to in Argentina is a very good one. The Argentine Forensic Anthropology team, or AF, are an excellent example of a domestically grown team, aided by one of the pioneers of this domain, Clyde Snow from the US, who came to Argentina and helped bring this team together in Argentina. But I think it showed how important domestic forensic capacity development is. That we talk about international forensic capacity, but ultimately, and what I found in my experience over those 25 years, is that it is fostering and driving that domestic forensic capacity. And I think the Argentine team are a great example of how that can be done and how they then use their experience from Argentina to help instill that in other contexts around the globe. I think you will always have international agencies involved to one degree or another, but without building the foundations at a domestic level, will never have a true impact. You can see a training here or a training there, but what long-term impact does that ultimately have? So I think while certainly raising these issues at an international level and having international organizations integrating forensic capacity into their portfolio, like the International Committee of the Red Cross has done, but where other agencies have yet to truly do that to the level it needs to be at, like with many of the UN agencies and others, I think we have to focus on the domestic needs to help drive international progress on this.
And in terms, then, I think, of thinking across those different domestic contexts, you touched on earlier in your initial response the importance of dealing with the disappeared in a culturally appropriate way. Can you talk to me a bit about how that works from, as an Irish person going into these different contexts, how you remain sensitive to those needs?
It's interesting. This was something that really came to the fore for me as I began to travel and engage in different contexts around the world. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and in particular in countries with an Islamic Muslim majority. And I remember a case that really stands out for me where I was giving a training or a centralization in management of the deceased and disasters in Afghanistan. And I was standing up giving a presentation, and I started getting questions from the first responders from the Afghani Red Crescent and other similar first response groups. And I couldn't answer them. And I'm very much of the belief, stick to what you know. And I certainly would not try to pretend I understand a culture that I've just arrived in. And I think you ultimately are always a guest. But that got me thinking. And I remember I was working with the International Committee of the Red Cross at the time, and I returned to Geneva, and happened to come across a presentation from the Islamic law scholar there, Ahmed al-Dawoodi. And we started talking afterwards. And to cut a long story short, we put together a workshop bringing together Islamic law experts and forensic experts. And I do question the word experts, but let's leave it at that for the moment, to answer a list and to discuss and answer a list of questions that we received from practitioners in the field. And I think that was a very powerful moment of where we look to ask first and then discuss, So instead of assuming I know, because, I've seen over the years how people go into contexts and make assumptions about what people want without any conversation with them. And I think that's a very dangerous way to approach these things. That whole initiative really sort of brought to the fore for me how going and asking questions and bringing on board community leaders, religious leaders into the designing of forensic programming is absolutely essential, because how we mourn, how we ritualize the dead differs across the world in an incredible way. But we have to understand that, and that necessarily what we assume people want is not necessarily what's most important to them.
I wonder if you could say a bit more about that point. So, as you know, I'm leading an AHRC fellowship at the minute, looking at the role of forensic experts working in transitional justice contexts. And something that's coming through in that is the importance of communication, and as well as sharing knowledge between communities, families, forensic experts and other stakeholders. I wonder if you could just speak to that, please.
Yeah, I think forensics and science can be often misunderstood. I think when we look at areas like forensic genetics, for example, which can be highly complicated. And if people don't take the time to go in and explain, to sit with people, to understand their concerns, I remember, when we were discussing some of the questions with the Islamic scholars, issues that people had around the idea of autopsies, what that meant language-wise. So the word autopsy in Arabic has a different connotation than it does necessarily in English. And so I think understanding language, understanding fears, which are only natural. Me arriving as a foreigner and looking to implement methods that are not something that people may be aware of and are naturally cautious. So I think you have to sit with communities and build trust. And I think this is at the very core of it, building trust, building respect, listening to people, looking to help design programs side by side with them. And I think no matter where that is in the world, you have to sit and do that. And often people will turn around and say, this is not what I want. And it's not for you then there to start trying to convince them it is. All you can do is explain, look to understand, and look to bring them on board in trying to see what it is they need, first and foremost.
Thinking about the global landscape in terms of disappearances and missing persons, you touched earlier on the fact that this is a very challenging time. We have missing persons, disappeared persons from conflict, related to migration in context of institutional abuse, and also resulting from climate disaster. How do you think the skills of a forensic expert map onto those different contexts? Like, what do you think that your experience as someone who particularly started out in this post-conflict context, I guess, how they lend themselves to the other areas in which we see these issues?
Well, I think they do massively. I think we look at climate change. The reality of climate change is going to be more severe weather, which is going to lead to more extreme disasters. And the need for preparedness planning is absolutely fundamental. And I saw during the COVID pandemic how exposed the contexts and states are due to a lack of willingness or to build and put in place the necessary infrastructure and systems to prepare for events like this. And so I think the role of forensics and the roles of, the application of these methods to be able to properly search for and recover the dead are only going to become more important. I mean, the dead matter to people. You know, we look at the importance of death in society. So we need to ensure that we have in place the systems to deal with that. And it's only through preparedness planning and working with those with the experience of searching for and recovering the dead, we will be able to do that. So I think there is a massive role. And I think there's been not a failure, but I really believe that international response agencies have not recognized the true potential of humanitarian forensics to support in the recovery efforts. And that may not always mean identification, but it means at least a dignified recovery and disposition of the deceased in these events. So I think on the issue of climate change, yes. I mean, without doubt, I mean, conflict remains a major concern. But I think forensics is, I mean, and certainly humanitarian forensics and applications across the board, I mean, do not just relate to the dead, but also to the living as well. And I think we see, a rise in intimidation of forensic practitioners, and where stories of issues in countries where, multiple forensic practitioners will have to sign reports in view of the intimidation they are receiving from the police and from others in the issuing of reports, for example, of ill treatment. So I think there's a significant risk to actual forensic practitioners in this domain as well. The conditions of work of forensic practitioners are often, very, very poor. There is limited investment from the state authorities. Ultimately, the dead do not vote. So the investment is not often where it needs to be on these issues. So while I certainly see the growing need for applying forensics in this domain, what concerns me is, and we see it right across the humanitarian and human rights sector, is issues of funding being cut for major aid agencies. I guess an erosion of the international legal framework. I mean, the humanitarian principles and the erosion of human rights as an idea. And also, I remember when studying human rights and political theory and back in the early 2000s and the emergence of the International Criminal Court and I guess a sense of optimism at that time, and fast forward to 2025 and where are we on those issues? So I am concerned at how global issues today are impacting both that funding and the ability to bring people to account for many of these atrocities.
I guess against that kind of backdrop for decades in terms of any progress being made on disappearances resulting from periods of conflict or authoritarianism, what is central is the efforts of families. I wonder if you could speak to that.
I mean, families have been at the very forefront of these issues. We go back to the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, to so many countries around the world where, families have gone out, have driven change in this area, have helped to support and advance forensics itself. It is ultimately, it is for them and their deceased loved ones that we are here. And I have always been struck by the perseverance of families, of communities, to look to address these issues. I think, of course, there comes fear, there comes often misunderstanding, which is more often fueled by poor communication by the state or by the responsible forensic practitioners to engage properly with families. I remember sitting at a number of presentations with families and seeing the concerned agency treating the families like children, saying, these poor individuals who've lost their loved ones, instead of seeing strong driven individuals and families who are the ones fighting for the authorities to do something about their loved ones. So I think that's something that has always, sort of riled me in the ways that families are often looked on as being the poor individual, as opposed to the people driving these processes more often than not. And it's often them that are dragging the forensic practitioners kicking and screaming to do something about these issues.
My main area of expertise is transitional justice, and that's a challenge that we see across the board, is a lack of recognition of the agency of victims. And yeah. I guess also the flip side comes from the fact that victims and survivors of conflict shouldn't have to be the ones doing this work. It is the state's responsibility. And in the context of disappearances in particular, I think it's an area where we really see, we only know anything about the disappeared because their families are speaking out. So,
and I think a really important thing, and it's got me thinking a lot recently about, we talk about the field of humanitarian forensics, but that there's been a lot of misunderstanding within that domain, in that field itself, by those involved as to what it actually means. There's often been a dichotomy between humanitarian efforts and human rights efforts, and they're not the same. And it's often led to friction. And I think that's completely the wrong way to look at it. I think when you look at what humanitarian forensics is, where is it mostly applied? It's applied in situations where people have lost trust and faith. So families and we have lost trust and faith in the state, as is the state quite often that has been the responsible in many of these scenarios. And humanitarian forensics is often there to try and rebuild that trust, to bring confidence back to the families, to discuss with them, to explain, to help rebuild that trust so that they can trust the systems that are now there to work with them as they drive forward these programs.
I know that, as you said, there is some debate around what humanitarian forensics means. So I guess just so our listeners know, how would you define it? And for you, does humanitarian forensics, does that preclude prosecution, or is it part of the picture also?
So I remember sitting with a group of experienced forensic practitioners discussing a definition for this when I worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross, and we had a forensic advisory board. And the definition came something around the line, the application of forensic techniques for humanitarian outcomes or efforts. But if I was asked today, that's not a definition that I would come out with. I'm not sure exactly how I would define it today, but I think we have to move beyond this idea of it only being for humanitarian efforts or only being for accountability. It is all one. It is all one. I think when I talk and I think about humanitarian forensics, I'm thinking about using forensics to rebuild trust for families, to strengthen the weakened medical legal system of country, to bring dignity back to the dead, and if possible an identity for which has been taken from them, but also to use medical legal systems to bring people to account. I think, yes, bringing people to account is often one of the hardest aspects of this, but I think we have to do that. And going in to implement a program under the banner of humanitarian forensics cannot be done legally in a country without often looking at accountability, because it is a medical legal system, and so I think it's, yes, you have situations where states will come together under the frame of international humanitarian law. And we saw the example of that in the Falklands, Malvinas only a couple of years ago, where an agreement between the Argentine and UK governments saw the excavation, the exhumation and identification of fallen Argentine service personnel under that banner. And that's so. But I think we cannot exclude the need for accountability. And for me, that's integral when I think of that banner.
I want to bring us back in our last few minutes to Ireland. As you mentioned, you're based in Swords now, and you're currently working on the exhumations at Tuam, which is a site associated with institutional abuse in the west of Ireland. I'm not sure if you can say very much about that, but I wondered what you can share about the work that's happening there.
So I returned to Ireland in 2023 to take up the first real project from my new organisation to lead the forensic side of the work for the Office of the Director of Authorised Intervention for Tuam, to look to plan the recovery and analysis of deceased persons related to that event. It's a real privilege to be involved. I never thought that I would be applying my skill set in Ireland, and it's a real privilege to be doing that and to be involved and working with such a great and dedicated team. But from a scientific side, from the complexity of the case is something I've seen myself in my own work over the years. So what do we know? What are the facts regarding Tuam? We know that the tireless work of Catherine Corliss brought us a list of 796 individuals who had died during the existence of the institution, and that's through the filing of death certificates. And we know, following test excavations some years ago, that remains of infants were discovered in a series of chambered underground tanks, and that those remains were mixed or commingled. Now, scientifically, dealing with commingled remains can be complex, and I have seen that myself in other contexts where efforts to best account and reassociate those remains is not a straightforward process. But I think by putting in place, and I saw this during my time working with the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team in Cyprus, with a bicommunal project there, by putting in place proper strategy and having, well-trained forensic staff on board, then I think you are best placed to gain the most that you can from cases like that in your efforts too. But I think ultimately the key is communication. So ensuring that people are informed of what is happening and why it's happening, and ensuring the necessary respect for the deceased.
So thank you, Oran, for sharing that information about the Irish context. Coming back now to, I guess, the kind of the global level, what would you say are the main challenges that exist moving forward?
I think probably the greatest challenge that exists is political will, and has always been political will. I think that has become more difficult to attain in recent years. And I think we see that with the state of affairs in the world today, proliferating conflict, erosion of humanitarian principles, all undermining efforts to allow for the maintaining the dignity of those who die. So I think that lack of eroding political will and eroding humanitarian principles are at the very heart of the challenges that are out there. I think the dwindling funding is immensely problematic. The deprioritization, I think, given the current state of affairs in the world of this issue, is very, very concerning. So I think they're probably some of the key challenges that exist. But I wouldn't say it's all doom and gloom. It's funny, I posted this question actually up on LinkedIn because I was at a point of mini despair at what I was seeing globally. But the comments reminded me that there is actually a lot going on out there. And whereas before, when I would have started, it was sort of bigger programs, either with the International Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or more laterally, sort of big international agencies like the International Committee of the Red Cross, work that the United Nations did in Kosovo and elsewhere, organizations like the International Commission, the Commission on Missing Persons, and others who are, out there. But I think what you're seeing now is that the idea and the discipline of humanitarian forensics is here to stay. And we see this through all of a sudden mushrooming up around the world are small to medium-sized NGOs, initiatives to drive this issue forward. And it's actually really, really inspiring to see. I mean, when you look at sort of the Argentine forensic anthropology team, who are still alive and strong, advocating for these issues around the world, I think there are many who look to emulate that, either as individuals or as bigger NGOs. And that's on a broad range of issues. You see it on Indigenous rights, you see it in terms of conflict, disaster response. So, and it's difficult to turn to a forensic conference today and not see a presentation or discussion on humanitarian forensics, which is incredibly encouraging to see. So I think that brings certainly a degree of hope out there that people still do care. But I think one of the big opportunities that is there, in certainly when it comes to the technical analysis of the remains. I mean, I think with the emergence of, and I know it's a bit of a catchword, like with AI at the moment, and I was discussing this with a friend recently, how that area could look to improve or advance specific areas of analysis and forensics, especially around commingled or mixed remains and that. So I think there are opportunities that need to be grasped. And so I think that's going to be an area where things might advance a bit in the years ahead.
I think that brings us to a natural stopping point. So I want to thank you so much for your time. I could ask you 1,000 questions, but it would end up too long for a podcast. So thank you so much for your time today.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.